Again, people are like, oh, are you a theist or are you a non-theist? How can you keep kosher if you don't believe there's a God commanding it? And I'm like, look, dude, I'm a post-theist. I am done with that. They're in the new atheist movement, and now I'm like, yeah, like what needs to be taken to the mat in that conversation has been taken to the mat in that. It had all the efficacy of a hammer. It was able to knock a lot down and build nothing. Right. Religion by his time, this sort of Prussian Protestantism, was so devoid, like you said, of this Apollonic aspect, that it was just emotionally bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt in some ways. What he saw people doing was rotely following the appearance of a religion without any of the actual stuff that religion's supposed to actually be doing.
Right.
He's not saying that God is dead in the sense that some metaphysical thing has happened. He's saying that religion has lost, specifically the kind of state Christianity that he was surrounded by, had lost the ability to inspire us. I think part of what makes that older world, that pre-modern world, or maybe even pre-contemporary world, I think so compelling, is that the Hellenistician mysteries was not a thing it wasn't you taking LSD alone in your bedroom and hoping for a mystical experience.
Right.
It was you with a bunch of people undergoing something terrifying and powerful. And it was a community of transformation. And I think that, again, religion has the ability, when in its best days, in its best modalities, to bind us together into communities of people who are using meaning as a way of navigating the world. There's wisdom in antiquity. These people were not stupid.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And returning for third-ish, fourth, maybe second, third, who knows, time is Dr. Justin Sledge, Esoterica, one of the great religion channels out there, and philosophy as well.
Thank you.
You inspired me in many ways to do my own channel, just from watching you throughout the years, learning from you about various aspects of religion and philosophy and how those things intertwine. Because I think a misconception that a lot of people today unfortunately have is there's only two things. You're either going to be stone cold, rational atheist, or you're a fundamentalist where you believe everything in the Bible is true and you have to follow it or else. Mm-hmm. But most people don't think that way. That seems to be some sort of internet war that's happening that sort of is very loud in these spaces when we talk about religion and we talk about philosophy, we talk about these different traditions that guide our lives and shape our culture. You are at the forefront of showing a side of religion and observing culture in a traditional sense, and staying rational, and also being, mature about it, and really leading in the forefront in that department is how you carry yourself and how you teach these topics. So I want to get into like myth and how myth sort of shapes our lives and gives us something to have structure with and something to not just believe in, but sort of like a guiding light. Mm-hmm. So we see this with Judaism, with Christianity, with Buddhism. It doesn't really matter, but these traditions exist, and they work for a reason.
Yeah, I think they're adaptive at some level. I'm not sure they're totally adaptive, but they are adaptive to some significant degree. I think we have this strange idea that, and we've inherited this from Christian polemics, right? The idea that the myths, the mythoi, the stories about the gods, if they're stories about the gods, well, then they're wrong because there's just one God. We do theology, they do mythology. You believe in the myth of Thor or Zeus, but I believe in the religion of Christ or Yahweh or whatever.
Right.
And so this term mythology has become an othering term, like magic, right? The Greeks were like, oh, that's what the magia, that's what the magi do, and it's bad and it's Persian. It's an othering term. Oh, we do miracles, y'all do magic. So it's an othering term. And so we've inherited this baggage where things are either true or they're myths. The myth of Bigfoot, the myth of Loch Ness Monster, the the myth of Jesus or whatever, mythicism. And I think this is a terribly unfortunate dichotomy that we've inherited, and which is interesting to me because a lot of the fundamentalists who want to tell themselves a myth, by the way, of being rational and detached and only interested in the objective truth or science or whatever, I think it's intellectually not true. But we've inherited this dichotomy where myth can only function as what's wrong, as opposed to saying, look, Kant made a fundamental insight about the nature of consciousness. That is to say, we never experience the world as it is. We experience the way the world is structured by our consciousness. So I never experience the way the world is. I experience the world through sight and hearing and the kind of brain I have. So I learn more about me, perhaps, than I do about the world when I'm experiencing the world. And I think one of the things that Kant left out, and maybe he gets to this in the third critique a little bit, and this is something explored by Jung and some other people, is that not only are we creatures who experience the world fundamentally through the structure of our consciousness, we also experience it through symbolism. We behave ritualistically in the world. We are creatures for which the world has to make sense. Otherwise we go crazy.
Right.
I mean, we can't live in a chaotic world. No one can. No one has the intellectual ability to live in chaos. We break down rapidly under those kinds of stressors. And so we've structured the world, and one of the ways we've structured the world is through myth. And I think that one of the ways that ancient peoples have a leg up on us, modern, rational, scientific people, is that they let myth function in a kind of gray area between being literally true. Zeus literally lives on Mount Olympus. He literally throws lightning bolts at people. He literally turned into a bull and did. I don't think many Greek people believe that.
Right.
But I think what they believed was these stories mattered. These stories structured their world. They told stories that somehow had some moral or otherwise symbolic or psychological value. And in many ways, they're more intellectually rigorous and with more integrity than we are. Because for us, it's either myth or the high road and the highway. And so I think that what I want to say about that is that this is a thing human beings do. And in fact, it is healthy for us to a significant level. We need to be doing it. The question is, can we do it responsibly, which I think we can, and how do we do it? Can we self-consciously do it? And I think we can. I think the second is true as well. And when I look at my own religion, I think one of the mantras that I often say is that I take my myths very seriously, but I don't take them literally. And I think that by taking them very seriously, because they do structure my world, they do inform how I think about the world, they do like change how I raise my kids, they affect how I talk to people, I treat people I don't know. They have all kinds of impacts on my life. And the truth of the matter is everyone has that. Everyone has it. I just happen to be self-conscious of the fact that mine is Judaism, and I own that fact. And I wrestle with it in a big way. But everyone's doing it. And because I can take them, and it's only because I take them non-literally, I don't think some guy named Moses went up a mountain and got a bunch of rules about what I can eat, that I in fact don't eat the things, because by abstaining from that, I'm now like entering into a world in which there is symbolic boundaries.
Yeah.
And again, who the hell doesn't need good boundaries? Like, good boundaries make good personality.
Right.
Good boundaries make good neighbors. Like, we need boundaries. And so I think this is a place where we can take some wisdom from antiquity and say, those people weren't turn it to 11 or turn it to 0 when it came to these things. They were always modulating that volume, how serious and how literal they took the myths. And I think that we should also be doing that. And I say that not because we are either doing it or not doing it. The truth of the matter is we are also modulating. Even the most hard-bitten Spinozist, atheist, naturalists still negotiating the world through myths, still negotiating the world through symbols. And the question is, we need to become self-conscious of that. And if some of those speak to people, they should embrace them. Whether that's becoming traditionally religious, whatever that means, or by embracing new spiritualities. There's nothing about spirituality that says that it has to be good to be old. I'm not Roman. My God doesn't have to be old to be real. I think there's all kinds of modern spiritualities that can be developed. Every spirituality was developed at some point. And so I think that this is a thing we need to be taking more seriously. And again, people are like, are you a theist or are you a non-theist? How can you keep kosher if you don't believe there's a God commanding it. And I'm like, look, dude, I'm a post-theist. I am done with that. That conversation was like cool back in 1992, like during the new atheist movement. And now I'm like, yeah, like what needs to be taken to the mat in that conversation has been taken to the mat in that kind of,
Yeah.
That's like,
it's been done, and it's sort of brought people into a place that I don't know if it was helpful.
No, I think it had all the efficacy of a hammer. It was able to knock a lot down and build nothing.
Right. Build nothing.
And
exactly.
build nothing. And I think it's left over, unfortunately, is a lot of people, especially a lot of young men. I think it's mostly young men, overwhelmingly young men,
Yeah.
who have been given that hammer, and they've been given only that hammer, and they have smashed and smashed and smashed. And what they're left with is a hole. They're left with a hole, and because this is a real thing human beings have to do, a chasm.
Yeah.
And it's led to extreme loneliness. It's led to turning to internet gurus of dubious value.
Right.
And it's led to an epidemic of loneliness and meaninglessness.
Right.
And again, as a man, and again, we don't talk enough about men's mental health. I think that a lot of intellectually smart dudes have only been given one tool to think about religion and spirituality and stuff like that. And I think that there's a lot more tools. And antiquity is one of the places we can go to learn about some of those tools.
Right.
And this is a place where I'm not a perennialist. I'm much more of a traditionalist in the sense that I was like, yeah, there's wisdom in antiquity. These people were not stupid. There are things we don't need to take it all. But I do think we need to be able to embrace some elements of the things they got right. And I do think they got a lot right.
I agree. You're sort of taking back the original definition of religio from the Latin definition of just way of life.
Yeah.
Not necessarily following a state religion from, whatever, the Church of England or something. Yeah. Not necessarily that definition of religion, but the religio as a sense of a way of life, having a user's manual to get through life. And it's sort of, user's manual sort of gives you a
bumpers.
Meaning.
It's bumpers, yeah. It's bumpers for the development of meaning. Sometimes I use this analogy of I like to play Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons gives you the bumpers by which to develop a good story.
Yeah.
And I think that Judaism and Dungeons and Dragons have a lot in common in many ways. It's a bunch of rules that you have to bend to make this stuff work. And I like it, but again, this is where I would say I play Dungeons and Dragons. I take the rules very seriously. Because the rules for how we adjudicate what's fair and what's not fair, they're actually the rules actually make it so the stories are fun and they work.
Yeah.
If you can do anything, it's not fun.
And it's like imagine opening up Dungeons and Dragons and having no rule book or user manual, and you're just looking at all the pieces like, what do I do with it?
Fun. Yeah.
Right. And that might be. And I think I agree with you with the whole perennialism versus traditionalism thing, because I think people who don't try to mix and match different traditions. I'm not making fun of the New Age people, really. I'm just saying, like, having one thing to follow seems to be more valuable than trying to just do everything and mixing all this stuff together that doesn't necessarily mix well.
And the people that will tell you that they're doing the one thing are actually mixing things.
And that's true, too.
Right. And so, again, I'm not saying it's one or the other.
That's a good point.
It's about modulating, right? And being self-conscious of the fact that we're doing that modulation. But again, it goes back to the point, right? To use the Dungeons and Dragons metaphor, right? Again, that it's one thing to play D&D, it's another thing to think you're an elf. It's when you cross that line into like, this is real, and if you don't play by the rules that I've inherited or I've invented, frankly, then like...
It reminds me of Alexander the False Prophet and Lucian.
Yeah.
We're just completely taking it to the next level, to the point where it's become... You're crossing the line from having structure and having religio as a way of life into sort of this sort of dark territory where it
becomes a paranoid fantasy.
Yeah.
And Lucian, I think, is, as a satirist. Again, it's hard to tell when he's being a satirist and when he's actually giving us really good data.
Yeah.
It's probably both.
Right.
Every good stand-up comedian is somehow simultaneously a anthropologist, a philosopher, a theologian.
Historian too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, humor is an incredibly important part of all this. That's also another thing, is religion's become completely humorless. Which is a telltale sign to me that something's gone disastrously off the rails. When religion lacks humor, run.
Good point.
I
never thought about that.
So it's like, I can say more about that, especially in some like the Book of Genesis. But yeah, that's why I like Lucian. And Lucian is like warning us, again, real wisdom about the dangers of fundamentalism from antiquity. Because we tend to think back then, oh, everybody was so religious.
They weren't.
No, they were just people.
Right.
And they were psycho-religious
And they
people.
weren't super rational either, but they were like us. Like we're very chaotic like that today.
Yeah, and again, I think that's why he's a huge writer too. It's like one of the most prolific writers to have survived from antiquity, hardly known these days. Not taken seriously because he's a humorist. And I'm like...
But his De Assyria gives us so much insight into religion of the 2nd century, especially in the East.
It's the only book.
It's the only one, yeah.
It's the only book, yeah. So, and again, people like... It's one of the, again, on Esoterica, man, I cover stuff that no one reads. Stuff that's literally legit, still in manuscript.
Right,
Like,
that's awesome.
It's like pretty, people, sometimes people complain on the channel, like, man, like, I have no idea what these words are. I'm like, bro, you're on a channel called Esoterica. Like, what do you think is going to happen? And I'm like, Lucian's a great example of, like, everyone sleeps on Lucian. Because he's just like, either he's a humorist and not worth reading, or that people just don't know about him.
Yeah.
And this is just a part of the failure of classical education and stuff. We just don't have much of a, outside of like one program in this country, there's no like classical books education that one can get.
Yeah, and another good example of that, Pliny the Elder, when he's discussing, he sounds like a modern thinker. I'll give you an example. When he's discussing, he starts talking about gods, and I think it's in book 1 actually. I think it's early on, and he's like, so many people have so many things for gods. They deify virtue, they deify episteme, they deify Sophia. I'm just making up examples. I don't know if he said those exactly. Then he said, but they also deify the cold, the common cold. And we have gods for everything now. He's like, if there is a God, there probably is an all-powerful God, an all-knowing God, but he probably doesn't care about what we're doing. He's like, so he's like going through all like the polytheistic into the Epicurean, into the, and like when I read that, it reminds me, not everybody in the ancient world was like, hi, my name is Pliny and I am blankist.
Yeah.
I'm not I am a follower of Epicurean philosophy. I am a follower of Stoicism. I am a follower of cynicism. Most people kind of borrow from all these schools of thought. They didn't just have to pick one.
Yeah, that's what we call Middle Platonism, is basically the mishmash of all that stuff. I mean, you tell me exactly what, I mean, you look at some of the Stoics, I'm like, you look at one individual Stoic, and I'm like, he doesn't even believe in, I don't know, divination, which is a core concept in Stoicism.
We started to have these arbitrary titles that we give on people in the ancient world, it seems like.
Yeah, and also just schools changed. I mean, again, I think about modern schools, and I think about a school, a philosophical school like postmodernism, or post-structuralism or Marxism. Is there agreement among Marxists and post-structuralists? And so, yeah, we shouldn't expect ancient people to be different than us. And the idea that when we say something like, oh, Stoics believed, what we're really saying is, well, we have this thing called Stoicism. Many people self-identified that way, and generally speaking, but when you get in the weeds, no, like Posidonius is not going to agree with Chrysippus. This is not. Do they roughly believe in a sort of fiery logos figure and the doctrine of apatheia? Yeah, they do. And that's what makes them Stoic, and so it's close enough to do with the Sethians or whatever.
Same thing with the Gnostics. They labeled Gnostics, right, yeah. The Basilidians are not like the
Cratians. Yeah. And I think, again, for me, the question, this is a thing that I come away from the philosophy of science, is that in the philosophy of science, we talk about theories as having various resolutions. So in a very low resolution theory, you cover a lot more of the data, but you explain a lot less of what's going on. So it has very powerful explanatory factor, but only explains a very small subset of things. Whereas if you have a really high resolution theory, start that over. With a really low resolution theory, you get a lot of data, but you explain very little. With a very high resolution theory, you get very little data, but you explain it very well. And I think that when you take something like Gnosticism, that's a very low resolution idea. You're getting a lot, but it doesn't make any sense. But when you zoom in, right, even in Valentinianism, Valentinus clearly had one system of Valentinus, the guy, but if you look at Apelles, his student, he's already changing.
His student Marcus is changing things too. Yeah.
And so, like,
from one student from one teacher to the student, things change him drastically. Look at Plato and Plato and Aristotle.
Yep. Yeah. And so I think, again, it's a question of At what level of resolution are you working? And on one of my channel on Esoterica, I'm typically working at a really high level of resolution.
Yeah.
Which means that you're disrupting a lot of categories all the time. Because at that, when you're getting that microscopic, the categories break down.
Yeah.
Because again, categories from a philosophical point of view, they're useful. They're not real.
Right.
And so, like, we don't need to shove things into categories unless we just need to do that.
I agree.
And so, like, for me, I'm much more interested in what does this one thinker in this one book say,
Right.
as opposed to let's talk. I'm gonna make a 40-minute video on the Gnostics.
Right.
I'm like, that's super low resolution.
Yeah.
But I'd rather let's get into, and this is why I love M. David Litwa. Like, he's like, no, I'm gonna do just Apelles.
You're right.
And I'm like, this is like super intellectually rich micro history that's really doing the high resolution work that I think is incredibly important in this field. Because otherwise, we paint with these brushes that are so broad that I don't think you're actually getting any.
We lose the richness of these ancient thinkers who are all individuals.
Yeah.
And they all have their own ways of looking at things. They'll have their own life experiences, just like people today.
It makes us feel good, right? When we say we can make these declarative sentences like the Gnostics believed.
Right.
It makes us sound like we know what we're talking about. But typically when I hear sentences like that, I'm like, the next thing coming out of your mouth is not going to be good.
It's going to misrepresent something.
Yeah.
You're already knocking off like half the category right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I often find that again, like that and YouTube is dominated by that very low resolution material. And it is dominated by that material because that's just the extreme low level of religious literacy.
Right.
The fact that people know about the Gnostics at all as a category.
I think religious studies needs to be more studied as maybe even high school level.
Yeah, I agree.
And not just Christianity and some at a fundamental level. Some people, I think philosophy influences theology. You have religions in the ancient world. You have these cults, right? You could call them religions, you call them cults, whatever you want to call them. And they're local. There's the Eleusinian mysteries. There's the Phrygian mysteries over here. Then you have down in Egypt, they have the mysteries of Osiris and Horus. And these, depending on what century you're looking at or what city you're looking at, you're going to have a different cult. Mm-hmm. And they're not a religion that we think of today, as in the Church of England is the same in London as it is in Edinburgh or whatever. Right. That didn't happen in the ancient world that way. I mean, you might have had a priesthood that was talking to another priesthood in another city, and they agree on things, and they're trying to keep a coherent cult intact, but it's just not the way it is that we think. But over time, philosophy comes into the picture. You get thinkers like Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Plato, and Socrates, and all of a sudden, these people start to change the minds of people in drastic ways to the point where it influences the theologians that come after. Mm-hmm. Then you start to get universal sort of priesthoods that come about, and there's more dogma, more doctrinal stances on things. There's a certain way that Genesis stories are told. Usually you have a creator who comes in and he creates heaven and earth, and he usually creates man the next day. Some similar creation epics that you start to see in different Vedic traditions and the Hebrew Bible and Hesiod. And they're not all the same, but you can see how they're philosophically aligned in certain ways depending on what period we're talking about. I say all that to say this, is that even if for the Gnostics, for example, even if we define Gnosticism as people who stress gnosis over faith. I've heard people, I've said this myself, I think it's a good starting point, but even if you did that, there's not, all the people we considered Gnostics don't even believe that.
Yeah,
a lot of them do stress pistis over gnosis.
Yeah, so Paul also, in certain documents, really talks a lot about gnosis.
Yeah.
More than pistis. Yeah. I mean, to go back to your point about religious literacy, teaching religious literacy, I've always made the argument that anything human beings have historically been willing to commit genocide over should be a thing we learn very quickly. Because genocide only happens because people aren't talking, they're killing. And religion is the thing people have been willing to do genocide over. No one is going to commit genocide over Pythagorean theorem. It's not going to happen.
Right.
No one's going to, you're not going to get, I don't think you're going to get militant Heracliteans.
Right.
Even though he's about war and stuff, I just think that philosophy doesn't inspire, asking deep questions doesn't cause people to go do bonkers. It may make weird people.
Right.
But it's not going to make for like weird, dangerous groups of people. Religion makes for weird, dangerous groups of people. And if we care about not committing future genocides, we need to be teaching people how to study religion critically at the youngest age they can.
I agree.
And so I'm like, not high school, man. I'm teaching my kids my kids are like, what is God? I'm like, you tell me, what do you think God is? Like, God is invisible? I'm like, do you think God's real? God might be like, it might be like your characters in your books. Like, is Spider-Man real?
That's what I was going to. You earlier you mentioned even people who don't necessarily follow a particular religion still have religious attitudes in certain ways. They have ways of life, even if they don't realize it. And I think I wanted to highlight something on that, because people who are secular, for example, the average Joe, they watch Netflix and they get inspired by movies, and those movies shape their personality, and they go out in the world and they want to be a better person because they got inspired by a character from a film that made them think something differently, and all of a sudden now they're acting in the world as a result of that. Film, music, poetry, plays,
sports.
Yeah. Exactly. You watch Michael Jordan. How inspiring is Michael Jordan when you see him dunking over a 7-foot tall center? It's inspiring. Yeah. And that inspiration is, to go back to the ancients, that's where like Socrates through the mouth of Plato, he sort of has this almost atheistic way of looking at the divine, where I think it's in Ion, where he says that, or no, Phaedrus, I think it is. It's this inspiration through the muse is where divine inspiration lives. So it's not like literally there's a God that's going to tell us to do something, but the poet who's inspired through the muse, that's where the divine lives. And I can dig that, because what causes us to be inspired other than the world around us, other than going and watching a play or watching a film or listening to music, that right there is the divine mania, if you will.
Yeah, this is a point made by theologians like Paul Tillich, who say that the divine is the radical, the coming into contact with the radical other, where you realize you are not the end of the world. You're not the end. You're not the main character. And I think a lot of Americans especially, suffer from main character syndrome, where we think we are the end all be all. That's part of the reason why I wear this kippah. Is I don't wear it because I'm trying to show anyone else that I'm religiously pious. I don't give a shit what people think. I'm wearing it because it's an excellent reminder for me that I am not the top of the world. There is literally something I put on my head every day to remind me, you end here. And there's something above you. Like,
humbling.
Yeah, and but also inspiring. Like, be open to the outside. Be open to being inspired. Because you're not the end of the world. Like, you are not, the world does not end here. Like, you are both, there's a you and also there's an outside, and being open to that experience of the other. I agree with you, that being open to that experience of the other in a radical transformatory way is at the core of these kind of mystical religious experiences. And it doesn't have to be that you're committing yourself to the idea that there is the God who is doing the thing, and therefore I don't think we're ever going to know the answer to that question. But the what's the right way? But the hubris to assume that you have it all figured out, and on your banging away on your Reddit thread about how all the religious people are stupid.
Right.
You've sorted it all out, and I'm like, it looks psychotic.
I agree.
Like, it comes across to me as like something like a kind of mania.
I agree.
And I'm like, that's not healthy, bro. Like,
I see people like that, and I wonder what is the goal here. Okay, you don't think religions are true. Cool. I don't either. You don't think there is a God that exists. Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think we can prove that either way or the other. So I think whatever. Then there's an extra step where it's like, people need to think the way I think. So I need to debunk their religions, and I need to prove that they're wrong, because I want everyone to be an atheist like me. And I see people like, cheer on. Oh, this person deconverted. Great. Maybe they were in a really bad situation. Maybe they were in a church that was, very negative, and maybe this person's going to have a better life now. Cool. But do we have to is this like an evangelical thing now? Are we doing some counter evangelical?
Oh, I think it's a religion. Yeah, I think it functions objectively as a religion. And yeah, I agree with you. If someone's in a toxic relationship with a belief system, I don't care what that belief system is. You can have a toxic relationship to a video game. I don't want you to have a toxic relationship to World of Warcraft or Marxism or Judaism. You can have toxic relationships to meme structures, to false worlds, like a video game world. Yeah, I'm all about people having healthy relationships to myth structures and belief structures and activities and stuff like that. But the idea that religion itself, ipso facto, is a toxic belief structure, I haven't seen people prove that.
Right.
I haven't seen the data actually deliver on that.
Actually, and to jump in on that, because that's a really powerful point you're making, I've seen in my life the opposite.
Yeah, I think
I've seen people lose loved ones, and religion is the one thing that brings that hope to the people who are mourning.
Yeah.
That, and I'm not trying to bash atheists right now that are watching this, but I do think that is one major aspect of life, that religion, and not just any particular religion, spirituality in general, does have its purpose. Is when we're burying our loved ones. That's like the domain.
That's one of them for sure.
Yeah,
it's adaptive, and it's certainly adaptive in specific settings for sure. But yeah, I tend to have the belief that bereft of those structures, we do quite poorly, and I think that's been borne out by lots of studies. But again, also I think that we're not condemned to have to rehash the religion of our forebears. So we have to, if you want to have the benefits of religion, you have to go whole hog and accept everything about Catholicism or Shintoism or whatever. I don't think that's true, because I don't think Catholics or Shintos do that, frankly. I bet you get to the Pope and talk to him in his heart of hearts, and I bet you'd learn all kinds of interesting things about what he doesn't believe, that he's supposed to believe.
Yeah.
And secondly, I don't believe in a God either. I'm like I said, I'm a post-theist. That conversation is just very uninteresting to me, aside from very abstract, intellectual, even logical stuff. I can mess with Gödel's ontological proof for God or something like that. But the question is really uninteresting to me. What I do think is, no, I'll say it's uninteresting, but also I'll say that might just be aesthetics. It might just be that I've come to that position because of an aesthetic position. Because if someone says, look, I believe in the principle of sufficient reason, which is an eminently reasonable thing to believe in, that everything that exists has a reason why it exists. There's a story as to why this microphone exists and why it's right here. And we can trace that story all the way back to some position in time that we'd agreed upon. The microphone comes into existence and eventually makes its way here. Well, that's true of reality too. That if the principle of sufficient reason is the thing we're committed to, well, where the hell did this come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? And it's reasonable to me if someone says, something intelligent put it here.
Yeah.
It's like the Big Bang. What banged? What put that there? If someone says, I think that's God, I'm going to call whatever did that God. I'm not going to say it's all powerful or all knowing,
or the Christian one, or the Muslim one in particular.
I'm going to call God the thing that is the principle of sufficient reason vis-a-vis this reality. The thing that answers that question is God. And that's what Spinoza said, by the way. But you need a logical reason why this is, and you need a moral reason, and we can debate that. But I think that's to me, that's an eminently reasonable thing to believe. Eminently reasonable. It doesn't commit you to much else. It doesn't commit you logically to anything else, frankly. Mm-hmm. But I've never had, but for me, even though that I find that to be a reasonable thing to believe, I'm just unconvinced that actually works for me. And I don't know why I'm not. It could be aesthetic. It could be totally irrational. It could just be, I don't like the word God.
Yeah.
Like I could just,
maybe I just, some baggage.
It's baggage. Maybe I'm just not drunk enough. I don't know. It could be all kinds of things.
Right.
But yeah, I think that one can imagine, and I do imagine and do practice, a kind of post-theistic religiosity. And I sometimes say I'm religious without being spiritual, which makes some people upset. Most people are like, I'm spiritual without being religious. Like, no, I'm religious without being spiritual. I don't believe in spirits or gods or demons, but I believe in the religion. I believe in the religio. And I believe that is the thing that contributes meaning, power, symbolism, community, comfort. It provides those things in a way that I see nothing else being able to do. And if you see something doing that and you want to toss it out, but you don't have anything to replace it with, I think you're going to create a social crisis.
Yeah.
I think modernity is born out of that social crisis. So we were really good at knocking it over, but we didn't replace it with anything. And when we did try to replace it with things, I think of the big political ideologies. They were many of them murderous. Like religion was murderous in many ways. And I think that we need to start having a conversation that goes beyond this question of, is mythology useful or not? We need to agree that it is. And we need to agree there's no getting rid of it. It's probably baked into our brains. So the question is, if it's there and it's going to be there forever, how do we become self-conscious of that fact? And how do we do that responsibly?
And I think, as I alluded to earlier, film is modern mythology.
Yeah, of course.
Like the Marvel movies is modern myths. They have a logos. They have reason with them. They have obviously a mythos behind it. There's these aspects that you find in ancient myth that we'd also find in modern day film. Even if it's not religious or dogmatic, there's still a message being portrayed. There's still a goal of the film.
Right, the deeply moral.
It's trying to highlight something in our society, even if it's in a different universe, even if it's through Lord of the Rings universe. You could still get your own worldview from. You could still see things in the world that you're in from that world, and it could influence things and inspire things. So I think film is one aspect of it. Obviously, this reminds me of. Friedrich Nietzsche's all over this, because his covering of the ancient world and his disagreement with Plato and his criticism of Christianity, for example, people get the wrong impression that this was some sort of like atheistic, completely, just trying to debunk Christianity. But I think what Nietzsche was actually saying is we have too much rationalism.
Yeah.
I think he was actually going and saying, maybe Homer was right. Maybe Hesiod was right. Maybe some of these ancient playwrights like Aeschylus and Euripides, maybe they were onto something where we should have this sort of mania, this sort of inspiration through the satyr. He uses satyr, for example, which is like the symbol of life, which is the symbol of tragedy. Instead of all this rationalism, the Logos and Plato and Christianity leaves all these holes that I think that's what he meant by the God is dead phrase. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that he's pointing to the fact that basically religion by his time, sort of Prussian Protestantism, was so devoid, like you said, of this Apollonic aspect, that it was just emotionally bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt in some ways. And I think that, what he saw people doing was rotely following the appearance of a religion without any of the actual stuff that religion's supposed to actually be doing.
Right.
So it was it was a sort of to use Jesus' metaphor, a beautifully painted sarcophagus. And so I think that that's part of it. I think that the proof that Nietzsche was right when he said that God is dead is that people go to sleep in church. Like, anytime that I go to a synagogue or go to, whatever, and, I see a guy in the pew asleep.
Not enough.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, you don't believe this. Like, this is just, you're just here because you have to be, because you're like, but, like, if I legitimately believed that if I did not do what that dude up there at the front of that room said, I was going to burn forever in a fiery torment, I'd be pins and needles awake.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that all it takes to prove Nietzsche right is to fall asleep in church, and so, or that there are going to be more tourists in Notre Dame than there are devout people. He's not saying that God is dead in the sense that some metaphysical thing has happened. He's saying that religion has lost, specifically the kind of state Christianity that he was surrounded by, had lost the ability to inspire us. It didn't have that ability to go back to your point, to inspire us. And I think that's what he was criticizing. And like I said, if you've ever seen a guy fall asleep in church, he's proving Nietzsche right.
I think that's what made, when we look back at the classical world and we kind of romanticize it, and we don't look at how tough life probably was for those people. But we also go, well, they had Homer, they had Euripides, they had the plays and the theaters, and they had the festivals every month. You know, the festival of Magna Mater was this month. The next month was the festival of Bacchus, and the festival of Apollo. And we're like, all right, we look at that and we go, whoa, that kind of is a colorful three-dimensional world in a sense.
So with medieval Christianity, they had tons of saints' days,
saints' holidays, right? So it's a very subjective. Yeah. It's very subjective in a sense, where you're depending on your worldview. You might look at the early medieval period. You might think that was the Bright Ages because everybody was Christian and everyone was living in this holy and whatever. But what I guess that what makes either of those subjectively bright instead of dark is the culture, which is the religion, which is the music that's being performed, which is the texts that are being written, the homilies, for example, or the hymns in the Orphic sense, whatever it is. Those are the things that really make the world livable.
Yeah, and they were deeply communal. That's the other thing we've lost too, is that so much of modernity is atomizing, it's splitting us off individuals. We all have our, I tend to romanticize the days of the cafe, where everyone's around the cafe and talking about things over drinks, or the pub where all the guys are getting together and drinking pints and talking about politics. And that's sort of the way I romanticize the world. It also had all its problems. Even the world of film, where we now have TVs in our houses and YouTube on our phone, and we can all separate off in our own atomized world. I think part of what makes that older world, that pre-modern world, or maybe even pre-contemporary world, I think so compelling, is that the Eleusinian Mysteries was not a thing it wasn't you taking LSD alone in your bedroom and hoping for a mystical experience.
Right.
It was you with a bunch of people undergoing something terrifying and powerful, and it was a community of transformation. And I think that, again, religion has the ability, when in its best days, in its best modalities, to bind us together into communities of people who are using meaning as a way of navigating the world. And the mysteries and other kinds of things were not atomized. It wasn't you by yourself doing it. It was always you doing it in a community of people. And so we've lost that communal aspect. And modernity is partially to blame for that. There's lots of things to be blamed for it. And the question isn't even whether who's to be blamed for it. The question is, what do we do? What do we do?
I agree.
I'm like, you can be as Marxist as you want to be and say, it's capitalism and this and that. I'm like, okay, great. It might be all that. Like, this is the Buddhist moment, right? Where the guy has the arrow stuck in his side, and he's talking to the Buddha, and the guy's like, well, what kind of arrow is it? What kind of shaft is on it? What kind of poison is it? Is it purple poison? Is a shaft this like this? Was it shot from this kind of... And the Buddha's like, it doesn't matter. You have an arrow in your side. Like, you can answer all those questions, you're going to die.
What do we do now?
You need to figure out
the question.
And I feel like, and I've been talking to people like John Vervaeke and other folks who are really committed to this, what he calls the crisis of meaning. I sometimes call the meaning drought. And I think it's high time that we come together, we begin to build our religious literacy back up, because those are going to be our principal resources. Whether we accept them or not doesn't matter. Those are the resources we have, at least in the Western world. We need to up our religious literacy. We need to begin building communities of people who are intellectually rigorous and talking about this, but also not intellectually rigorous in a sense of it's like memorizing much of lore because you want to be the lord.
Right.
It's like, how does this lore, how does this arcana, how does this esotericism, how does all this religious stuff contribute to us building communities of meaning? And those could be, I think, quite varied. And again, they don't have to take the form of traditional religions.
Right.
They don't have to take the form of, I think that, I think of the Hermeticists or even the Stoics. They were just pretty loose communities, perhaps, of people who shared some touchstone values, but were mostly just trying to figure out how to navigate the world using
symbols
and other kinds of ideas they had. And I think that we need to get away from, even like this debate culture stuff where it's all about who's right and who's wrong. I think there's going to be, first of all, the question is not going to get settled. And secondly, it's coming out of a polemical tradition that actually was engineered to do a lot of harm.
Right.
That whole debate culture was engineered out of the world of Latin polemical culture, which Christians were using logic to try to convert Jews under duress to their religion. I just don't want to have anything to do with that culture.
Which is like sophism 2.0.
Yeah, it's awful. I'm like, I don't want to have anything to do with that culture because it's just performative identity politics.
Yeah.
Everyone walks out of that room thinking they're right, and everyone's still alone, and they feel terrible. They're like, I don't feel better for having watched some guy lose a debate on the internet.
Right.
The question is, how do we begin this process of building meaning? And yeah, I get offers to debate all the time. I'm like, I'm not really interested in having a debate about who's right and who's wrong. But what I am I'm interested in having conversations around even difficult lines with people who I really don't agree with about why is it that the message that you're bringing is meaningful to people. Because that's interesting. And how can we talk about best practices, and how can we talk about doing that responsibly? Because there have been a lot of people in the 20th century and the 21st century who've been able to build meaning around things like cults of personality and done enormous harm. And we just like internet guruism, all this stuff, we need to turn that stuff off, and we need to begin having frank conversations around the reality of mythology, because it is real. Like you said, from Spider-Man movies to athletics to religion
to a great song,
like people bawling their eyes out of a Taylor Swift concert because you're like,
that's a spiritual experience. Swifties, that's a religion.
Yeah, it certainly functions objectively in a religious way. I agree, and we just need to start having this conversation, because the elephant's in the room. And if we're not willing to have a conversation because it makes us uncomfortable because we're atheists and we don't do that, we don't need mythology because I'm real. You're you're doing it.
Right.
Like, you're doing it. Like,
I couldn't agree more.
And so let's get over ourselves, because I think that I don't want to be lonely. I don't want to suffer I don't want to be part of this. And I don't want young men. I'm in my 40s now. I got young guys who watch Esoterica episodes, and I hear from them, and they're hurting. And I don't want them turning to internet gurus that are really feeding them pretty toxic stuff. And they're like, well, what's your alternative? Like, I don't know what the alternative is. I'm not going to convert them to Judaism. That's not my job. I don't want anything to do with that. But what I want to convert them to is a conversation around this process of meaning building and the centrality of myth in the human experience. Because if we don't do it, we're going to do it unconsciously. And I think I can again attribute that to Carl Jung, that let's just subconsciously do it. Let's embrace the importance of myth, and let's admit that we're doing it already. And I think if we self-consciously embrace it and try to talk about how to do it responsibly, I think we're going to end up in a much better place than this weird denialism stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, because if your goal is to get everyone on the same page, to be completely rational, and to teach people that we only have one life and after you're dead it's over, you got to realize that people are going to have different the consequence of that is that people are going to interpret that differently. Not everyone's going to be. Some people are saying, well, this actually gives me more meaning, that there's only one life and I got to live my life to the fullest and be as good as I can so the generation behind me has a better world to live in. That's great. That's the way you interpret that and it makes you a better person. That's great. But not everyone's going to think that way. Some people might have a crisis of meaning and go, well, this is it? What's the point? And that you don't want. So everyone needs to have their own way of dealing with how to have meaning in your life, how to have purpose in your life. And that's why I think religion and spirituality outlets are important, because they give people that, number one. Number two, I think what religion did in the ancient world that we don't have as much today is it sort of fills in the gap of psychiatry in a sense, or psychology, I should say, along with the sort of meaning that comes along with legends that shape our history and who we are as people that live in Alexandria, and they believe in the Serapis mythology, and they're all unified by that. But there's also the aspect of going to the Serapeum and being healed by a priest, and there's sort of this aspect of psychology happening. So we have psychology today, we have psychiatry today, and that's great. That works for some people. For other people, they might want some other outlet to get those holes, those sort of gaps filled in.
Yeah, and you know, again, psychiatry is only as powerful as the drugs we can make.
Right.
And God knows that's all wrapped up in the pharmaceutical industry, and there's real problems with that, we can all admit. And also, again, psychology, it's one tool. And I think that when you have a crisis, you need to bring to bear all the tools. And this is why I said go back a moment ago, we need to up our religious literacy game. This is, again, why I really appreciate the work that you do on your channel, is you're really going back to a lot of these old texts, you know, Lucian, stuff like that. No one reads this stuff. And being like, no, like, there's tools here.
Right.
For understanding the myths that we've inherited, from understanding the religions we've inherited, for like getting for just like making meaning in the world. And I really appreciate the work you do in that regard. But there are people that have come to me and said, hey man, you know that at Esoterica, like, I know that you're not a believer, but just so you know, there are weirdos taking your videos and like trying to practice this stuff. And I'm like, are they doing it because it makes their life better and it gives them some sense of meaning? They're like, yeah, but aren't you committed to like
rationalism?
Yeah, and I'm like, I'm committed to people having good lives.
Right.
I'm committed to knowledge upping the bar of human flourishing. And I don't have, God forbid, I have the hubris to police how people make meaning. Are they hurting anybody? Hurting themselves? Like, I'm glad that if I've been able to connect them to an ancient technology or a medieval technology, or which they've been able to like sort the world out in a meaningful way to them. Hell, more power to them, man. Yeah, I'm like, I'm not here to. I agree. I'm not here to have my personal lack of belief in something become the baton by which I, you know, beat people who disagree. But like, I don't.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think there obviously needs to have, obviously needs to have rationalism at the forefront of a rational society. Science needs to be science, but also there is space for this sort of abstract mythology and things that give people purpose outside of rationalism. I think there needs to be a balance. I think that might be the answer to all this.
Sure, at some level. I mean, again, but again, science has limitations. It can only tell us about how the physical world is interacting. Well, we don't live in that world all the time. And so, again, I think that any good scientist is going to tell you there's a limit to what the kind of problems it can solve. For instance, it can solve how problems. How do chemical reactions occur? It can't solve a why problem.
Right.
You know, and so it certainly can't solve problems like, what is the meaning of life? Why do I feel sad?
And the abstract can answer those in some ways.
It's probably the only thing that can.
Right.
So yeah, I just think it's about being honest about what things do. Now again, when a religion or mythology tries to come and say the world is literally 5,000 years old, and we have overwhelming evidence from geology to contend otherwise.
Right.
I got bad news for the myth. You can't take that part literally. And now, again, when I read the creation story from a Torah scroll, is it meaningful to me? It's meaningful to me, but it's meaningful to me because I don't have to take it as a literal story about how the universe came into being.
And not only that, when you actually look at the Torah scroll for what it is, it's a text that was written by multiple authors across a span of multiple centuries and multiple cities, and it's even interpreted multiple ways. If you look at the Mishnah, the Gemara, they have different ways of interpreting it. That makes it more valuable than it is when you say just Moses wrote it in 1300 BC and there's only one way to interpret it.
Yeah.
That's really dull. You just dulled the whole reason why this thing is magical. Yeah, what makes it magical is the truth about it.
Yeah, and the physical object of it. I mean, I tell people, like, it's not like I tend to roll the Torah scroll. My wife is a rabbi, as you know, and when she's getting ready to lead services, I'm typically, I get delegated the grunt work of rolling the Torah scroll. And I have to say, there's something powerful about opening up the Ark and taking this scroll that someone hand copied. Hand copy. It takes months to hand copy something. The dedication that goes into, the athleticism that goes into hand copying it, and then opening it up. I mean, this heavy physical object. I mean, these things can weigh 30, 40, 50 pounds. And to me, that's extremely impactful to have that relationship with this text, just as a physical object, a ritual object. Not to say all the things you mentioned, right? That you're looking back into the past. And at some level, I'm hearing my ancestors' voices recorded.
Yeah.
And I think that
The past is living on through you.
Yeah, it's living
that
on.
That's a powerful thing if you think about it.
Yeah.
If you take a step back and say, in a sense, we are eternal because we carry on our traditions of our ancestors, and it's what makes us eternal.
And we're stewards of them.
Do we really want to stop doing that?
Yeah.
That's like, do we really want to just like end eternity? Because that's what we'll do if we stop our traditions, in a sense.
Yeah, and not just that, but like there's a sense in which like this got them through. You're here because somehow this got them through. Are you wise enough to throw that away?
Right.
Do you have the wisdom to know that this is just like a bad idea? All of it's a bad idea? I think there's a lot of baby with the bathwater there.
Exactly.
And I'm just like, let's go slow with what we throw away. And I belong to a tradition called Reconstructionism, and Reconstructionism has as a mantra that the tradition must have a vote, but it can't have a veto. That the tradition must have a vote, but it can't have a veto. And what that means is we need to be informed by the tradition. But the tradition can't just like be peer pressure from dead people and just tell us what to do. Because we're self-conscious, rational people, and what we have to do is, that means that you have to be able to tell the tradition no. But the only way to be able to tell the tradition no is to be able to read the Mishnah, read the Gemara, read the codes, and bring the tradition's voice to the table. And then, after making a very informed analysis of the tradition, then you can say no. Because otherwise you're not really saying no, because you don't even know what the tradition has to say. And I'm always trying to balance out those two sides, that modularity, right? I want the tradition to always have a vote. I don't want it to have a veto. And where am I vetoing it? Why am I vetoing it? And or why the community is, individual people don't, whatever. And so I think that, again, we're always doing that. We're always, every tradition's do, the Catholics, the atheists, everybody's doing it. And to me, it's part of Reconstruction Judaism is we just need to be self-conscious about the fact we're doing it.
Yeah.
And let's just own it.
I agree.
Let's just own it.
I'm actually involved in a project right now that's trying to purchase a old church that has really nice Ionic columns on the outside, by the way. It's in Columbus, Ohio. And our goal is to transform this into a temple to the muses and make it a center for people to go and study ancient texts and perform music and do plays or whatever. We haven't really mapped out exactly what we're going to do with it, but the goal is to sort of make a religious center.
Make a museum.
For people. Exactly.
Museum, yeah.
It's exactly what our goal is. We have some people involved that are going to help, fund and all this stuff, which I'm one of them. Which, stay tuned, because you'll hear more about this coming out soon. But the goal is to sort of replace, to say, you know what, I think Nietzsche is right. I think we do need the satire involved in our everyday lives. We do need the tragedy involved. We do need the muses. We do need inspiration from the ancients. And I think places like that will sort of fill the void, along with what you're doing and continuing the traditions that are already in place.
Yeah, it's going to take a whole lot of experimentation. We just don't. We're not even in the point yet where like the spaghetti's not ready to even throw against the wall.
Right.
Like we need to get the spaghetti ready and throw some against the wall, and because who knows what's going to stick and what's not going to stick.
Right.
It's interesting. I was thinking, you spend much time in New Orleans?
I haven't been there, no.
If you ever go to the Garden District, there's a great area in the Garden District where they have all of the roads are all named after the muses. So it's 3x3.
Ooh, yeah, I think I've heard of that.
It's a 3x3 section of the Garden District where the roads are named after the muses. But yeah, I think we're just going to have to spend. We're going to have to spend a couple of generations. It's going to be several generations just experimenting, and I think some stuff is going to work, some stuff isn't going to work, and
you go from there.
Yeah, because I don't think we have a choice. Because this epidemic of loneliness, this epidemic of meaninglessness, this epidemic of like dudes taking the black pill, like.
Right.
I'm done with that. Like I need like that. That's not the answer.
Yeah.
That despair, anger, rage, like these things are emotions that are they're just dangerous. And I want to see people and young men who this epidemic is affecting, I think, most pronounced. I want to see them flourish, and I don't think they're going to flourish with a bunch of 2-bit internet personality guru people, and I don't think there's going to be one solution. I think there's going to be a lot of solutions, and I think and it's not going to be the thing that it's not going to happen on its own. It's going to happen because people want to try to experiment with it, and I want to be part of that, and I'm glad you want to be part of that, and I think that I think that it's out of that kind of experimentation these communities are going to emerge, and we deserve it. We deserve to live meaningful lives. Everyone deserves to live a life that is meaningful, fulfilling, and flourishing, and that doesn't have to come at the price of, oh, that means I have to accept a bunch of dogma.
Right.
We're not playing a zero-sum game here. And the way that the new atheist movement and the way that religious conservatives have framed it is a zero-sum game. And I don't have to pick. And I think being forced to pick has left us bereft. It's left us totally intellectually paralyzed. And I don't think I need to pick between those two camps.
Well said. I couldn't think of anything else to add to that, and I'm really glad I got to get to have a conversation with you for my channel. Any projects coming up? What do you want to promote? Anything like that?
I mean, what am I promoting these days? I mean, the channel's really my only thing. I don't have social media just because it scares me. But yeah, I'm leading a tour group to Egypt to do some stuff there, and yeah, I think the only thing if folks want to take a look at my channel, Esoterica, which is interesting because the conversations like this that I don't do over there, because this is what I believe in my own thinking. So I've been thinking a little bit more about how to get my own kind of intellectual project out there. I don't know if it's starting another YouTube channel, which I hope it's not that.
Could be.
It could be, but I do appreciate, and really, it's a real honor to me to be able to come on to your channel and talk a little bit about kind of my own thinking and this material. So it's really, really lovely to be able to chat, not about medieval 15th century manuscripts about magic, but to be like, oh yeah, this is actually what Justin believes.
Right.
So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that.
And I hope this was as refreshing to me, to the people watching, as it was to me just now.
So.
Thanks for your time, and you have just attained true gnosis.